Hello, I'm Phil Little, host of the Private Investigator Experience podcast, where we talk about the life and times of a PI and the cases we work. Thank you for joining me today. If this is your first time with us, I own West Coast Detectives International, a 102-year-old global security firm, and I look at cases I work on through the lens of my military, law enforcement, intelligence service, and global security experience. And then I add a touch of a biblical worldview to come up with a solution. But today, I'm in one of those times which we have the privilege of having on a guest. And let me give you a little insight into this guy before I tell you about his background. In life, we run into people that are maybe one-dimensional. They're good at research or maybe not so good at writing. And then maybe they're good at writing, but they can't present it to the public. Well, we have a three-dimensional guy today. Not only does he know the facts and what's going on, he's an excellent writer. When I came out of law enforcement into the private sector, law enforcement, we do a half-page report. Oh, we're great. Well, the public sector, if we did that, the client would say, "You're charging me all that?" So we do a 2.5-page report. We know how to write reports. And Bob not only knows how to write reports, he knows how to present. I've seen him in action, no matter where he's at, on the street, with a line guy or somebody off the street or a room of generals. He's got their attention. Now, who is he? Well, he's Bob Doughtery, and he has over 25 years in undercover operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, and we know that as the CIA. And he has personally managed and carried out multiple high-level missions in the U.S., Europe, Central America, South America. He's worked against all the terrorist groups, Islamic terror groups, going back to Qaeda and bin Laden and up through Hezbollah, Hamas, and on we could go with that. He's got over 20 service medals from his career. And then right after 9/11, he was part of the CIA operation at the Joint Terrorism Task Force and led that in Los Angeles. And he's also a public speaker and a writer today. He's also still active in briefing government and military agencies on strategies of finding out who the terrorists are, fighting them, and the intelligence gathering. And Bob is also a guest speaker on Skyscape. Bob, welcome. Thank you for taking your valuable time to be with us today.
Thanks, Phil. I don't know who that guy is, but I'm happy to be with you and talking to you, my old friend.
Well, one thing I forgot to add, I was going to put in there when we get to talking off the top of our head. I've said before, and there's probably 2 or 3 people, maybe, in the world that I could send any place to represent me. And Bob is one of those that I could send any place in the world. And I know I would be represented and West Coast Detectives would be represented with the way I would do it. So he's a special man, special person, special friend, special talent. And I know he's got some things today. The purpose of what we do here on this podcast is I don't want to try to convince you to think like I do. I want you to get enough information that you're going to say, I'm going to check this out. I'm going to investigate for myself. And then you make decisions about what is going on, not what is always being said in the press or whatever. But let's go. People were interested in the CIA. They're interested in James Bond and all the intelligence stuff. And everywhere I go in the world, even as a private investigator, people would say, "Oh, I would love to be that." And I know you've gotten that too with being in the CIA. But where did it all start with you? Where did you grow up, and when was it you knew that you were going to be CIA, or was it in your DNA and you just knew one day you were going to be meeting that Natasha from the KGB in Paris and you were going to win?
That's a great question, Phil. And again, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on with such a longtime colleague and friend. So happy to be here with you and share some stories. Actually, probably a couple different influences on my life that led me to public service. My father was a county probation officer early in his career for LA County, and then he went on to become involved in local politics at the county level as a supervisor. And then my mother was a public school teacher. So I think maybe that kind of ran in my blood, a little bit of the public service. And then when I got out of school at UCLA was right when Ronald Reagan was taking office. And so we had kind of gone through a dark period of our time with Americans taken hostage in Iran and kind of the Jimmy Carter years and the gas embargo. And now it seems like we were kind of coming towards that bright, shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan always talked about. So that kind of motivated me as well, his presidency. And I actually applied to a lot of different federal agencies. I think the FBI was only taking accountants and lawyers at the time, and eventually got selected by both the DEA and the CIA, and was rejected by the CIA at first and applied again and got in again and went through the process and ultimately was hired. So I think there was a little bit of a blessing looking down on me as well, but
Right.
probably would have gone into the military if none of that would have worked out. That's was kind of my patriotic drive at the time.
I remember when I went in the military, after I was going through boot camp in the TNW, I said, "What in the world am I doing here?" What did you, when you hit the farm and started training, what were you thinking as you went through there, and how did you come out of that? How did that change your thinking?
It was all new, and I hadn't really experienced the East Coast before. I was a West Coast boy, kind of like you were. And in fact, I was the only one in my class of probably 50 or 60 career trainees that was geographically from west of the Mississippi. So it was really not as diverse as it is today in terms of the selection process. So I was known as California Bob or Surfer Bob because I had done some surfing on the beaches here in California. But no, I kind of brought that laid back but focused kind of style, and it served me well. And just absorbed everything as I was going along. I thought the training was fantastic. It was all super new and exciting for me. Actually did very well, again, for the grace of God in the training, which again, I kind of subscribed to my public school upbringing and regular city streets upbringing that allowed me to have some common sense and some street smarts. And I thought it was great. And being a part of this big national security mission, it just, filled your head, right? It was what really drove you on. So I was very happy, excited, nervous, and stoked to be in that training and to
Mm.
finish it up and start my career.
Was your idea of what the CIA was like from your district's knowledge of what was going on in the world and all that? Was it like what you thought it was going to be, or was it different?
That's a great question. I was really ignorant when I entered on duty, to tell you the truth. I had probably hardly done any research. I mean, you remember back in the day, that was before cell phones and the internet. So I was probably influenced by Hollywood more than anything. And of course, it's a lot different than the Hollywood spy movies. There's some similarities to be sure. I wasn't disappointed. We did a lot of paramilitary training. So I got to be around guns and land navigation and airdrops and all that kind of stuff, resisting, a SEER training like you probably went through some form of in the
Yeah.
military.
Yeah.
So I was happy with all of that. And then when I actually got on the job, happened to go to my first tour to a place that was fantastic and dangerous and lots of stuff happening. So I was not disappointed in what the actual work turned out to be compared to what my vision of it was.
As you went along, did you develop some segment of your work, like we can all do that, and we say, "This is my passion of this whole operation. Now I want to focus on that and stay in that," or were you just open to office headquarters or wherever they send me? It's okay.
That's a good question. I'm like you, Phil. I'm a people person, although I actually test out as an introvert, but I
Mm.
love the people part of it and meeting people on the ground, getting what, we would come to call ground truth reality of what's really happening in the situation. And then not only working with people one on one like that, whether they're sources, whether they're potential sources that you're trying to recruit, or whether they're your colleagues or someone else working against the Russians or the Chinese or a terrorist group, but then trying to put that all together in your mind and come up with a good intelligence operation to achieve the objectives that you wanted. And that's what really intrigued me about it. I never loved being in the office all the time. I realized it was necessary to do your writing and your accounting and all that. I love being out on the streets. I love being out in the country. I think that's what drew you and I together probably when we first met, is our love of
Yeah.
travel and our love of different cultures. And I
Right.
think that was probably in me already. So I really love that aspect of it. And I was successful at staying away from headquarters my entire career. So I don't know if that was smart or stupid, but I spent 23 of my 26 years in the field, and I was really happy about that. And I love the work of being in the field. And I always just wanted really to do that and to learn that and to excel at that.
Yeah. Well, I know that the travel and being exposed to international things can change us. I found that out in my work in the public sector. You were in a small region. I had several officials from LAPD that had joined me over the years after they traveled some and decided, oh, well, this is a lot better than sitting around Los Angeles. And they got addicted to that traveling and experiencing what you said, international things and meeting people from all over the world, which most of us have similar needs, likes, dislikes. And I've always said if the people could get together, get governments out of the way, we could probably solve the world's problems. But if I ask you the question, just kind of a kickoff here, if you were asked to give a briefing to the top guys today and said, what do you see as the most dangerous enemy situations that we have to face now where we're at, what kind of a summary or briefing would you give them on what we need to be paying attention to?
Well, give me a couple of minutes and I'll work through this. One thing, let's start off with one thing that is not a national security threat, and that is climate change. And I hate to be political right off the bat, but I've heard so many of our top military officials and intelligence officials and government officials say that climate change is the number one national security threat. That's just plain ignorance and it's plain wrong. A national security threat is an entity or an organization or a country or a group of people that poses an existential challenge to the future of this country. And there's really only two entities that do that could end this country tomorrow. And that's Russia and China. So by definition, China and Russia are the number one and number two national security threats to this country. We may argue that climate change eventually in 50 or 100 years may represent some sort of security threat. I will have that argument or I will have that discussion with you. But right now, it is not a national security threat. And anybody that goes around promulgating that, I'm sorry, it's just plain wrong. Obviously, to me, China, of those two threats, represents the biggest threat by far. I think people forget that Russia economically is not a strong power, has never been a strong power economically. I mean, back in the day, in the agency, we used to characterize them as a third world country with nuclear missiles, right? And as it turns out, their military is not that good. So they're really a distant second to me in terms of real national security threats to us. They are because they still have nuclear weapons. They still have a very capable and big military. They are led by a leader in Putin that is very aggressive and confrontational. And they're interfering in our internal dynamics of our society as well. That makes them dangerous and will make them dangerous for years to come. China, on the other hand, has an even bigger military, probably even more superior in terms of technology. They also have a very aggressive and confrontational leader in Xi, and they have the economy to back it up, whereas Russia doesn't. China wants to eclipse us and dominate, not only militarily and politically, but economically as well. And they're well on their way to securing that. So to me, by far and away, the number one threat to our country, and probably will be for the next 5, 10, 15 years, is a very resurgent China that's looking to dominate in all three spheres. I would say that a secondary threat in my mind is what I would call that convergence between technology and innovation and fanatics. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize laureate and concentration camp survivor, had a quote which I love, and I think this will resonate with you too as well, Phil. He said, the problem of the 21st century, the 20th century, the problem of the 20th century was fanatics armed with power. That will be the same problem that we face in our century. And he's absolutely right. The CIA did a great study years ago where it looked at the past 100 years of modern history. And one of the conclusions that they came up with, which was quite startling, is they said, not innovation, not technology, not our advancement forward in any field has led to instability in the world, but individual leaders have caused the most instability in the world. And if you look back at the past 100 years, what do you have to look at? Hitler, Mao, Stalin. There's three right there. Those three men probably caused more harm, more death, more destruction in modern times than any of the three men. And so they definitely drove those engines of destruction, of repression. Well, we have Putin nowadays. We have Xi. We have Kim in North Korea. We have the mullahs in Tehran. We're surrounded by individuals, fanatics, who are armed with power. And it's a very challenging and threat-filled world for us out there. I would say terrorism falls way further down on the scale, although with the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, it was brought back to the forefront. What worries me about terrorism or extremist groups is they're getting hands on some of this technology and this innovation and using it in some sort of mass casualty attack, like a drone swarm controlled by AI, using synthetic biology to create a virus and echo the COVID pandemic. So that would really kind of be the spectrum of threats if I was giving a briefing that I would be concerned about. And I would sum it up by saying, I think it's a much more threat-filled world today than we have probably ever had. It's not the old Cold War where we just had the Soviet Union. Now we have a myriad of threats, and then they're worldwide. They're not just focused in one geographic area.
In a recent Sheriff's Association meeting back in D.C., the FBI director had made a statement to them that there was more activity right now in chatter than before 9/11. And he considered that it's only when, it's not if, that a big terrorist attack is going to occur. And I know that was a pretty bold statement for him to make in that group. And I know some of the sheriffs has got very active since then and coming out, realizing how unprepared we were. Probably when you look back on what's happened in our society, you go back 100 years and start looking at the progressive activities that's gone up and down, and they had increased and they get pushed back. Probably the last 40 plus years was when we've really seen this, whatever you want to call it, the woke society take over in every factor. I was thinking today, as I was thinking about our talk, that I know when my boys went to college, I didn't hear them talking about all this radical stuff, and their professors were all indoctrinated to the left and Marxism and trying to get them and running down America. But then a few years later, my daughter was younger, and in the early 2000s, when she was in college, it had changed. It was radical. And she, as my daughter, was a little more conservative, and she had a tough time with that. So we've watched this change, and the attack in Hamas, this so caused me to stop, and I was amazed. I couldn't think that the Israelis would let that happen, and I couldn't think that it would take on the level it has of anti-Semitism around the world. But when you look at where you started, the CIA, and when you ended, what changed? What was the difference? With that agency you went into, what did you see happen over the years that you want to talk about?
I think I agree with all your points, and it kind of mirrors what we've seen happen with U.S. government agencies, in my opinion, which is, hey, look, there is no doubt when I first started the CIA, it was a white man's East Coast culture. Absolutely. And was there a racism and elitism and discrimination against women, minorities? Absolutely. Absolutely. And slowly, as society did, we tried to work on those things and get better and better and better, as we should. I don't think you're ever going to eliminate them. And there's no excuse for them in any form. However, what we have now, what we've swung to, is the opposite direction, where the extreme minority in our society, the extreme minority in our government agencies now rules over the majority in terms of the mission and regulations and what's right is right. Excuse me. So that's not good either. And that leads to ineffective missions, ineffectiveness of being able to do your job. So I think the pendulum will swing back to the center. You and I have been around long enough that we see these swings in society, and then they always come back to the center, hopefully. But I see that in the agency, that we've become so distracted. And actually, one of the things that has spurred me, as it spurred you, is I put together a whole leadership training, which I do now for the private sector, which is talking about using special operations and CIA best practices in the private sector. And one of the things I talk about on there is being distracted from your core mission can be disastrous. And I use the case in the CIA when we lost 7 of our officers at Forward Operating Base Chapman to a Taliban double agent. because we got distracted from our core mission. And that can happen, obviously, in the private sector as well. And a lot of this new age wokeism type of stuff seems to me to be distracting private corporations and businesses and entities and government organizations from their core business of what they should be doing. Not that diversity and treating your workforce better and recruiting a wide spectrum of people and honoring every employee and respecting them is not the right things to do. Absolutely, that is. Guys like you and I never thought differently. We always had that down, and we treated people based on our own faith-filled version of how you should treat people, right? Not based on who they are, the color of their skin, their age, their gender. And we were like that. And a lot of us in this work were like that. And then also, we judged you professionally on how well you did your job. We didn't care about your skin color or your age or your gender. So in a way, we've gotten away from our fundamental core beliefs as Americans. We're always there. It wasn't something we needed to have fixed. And so wokeism to me is misplaced. We just need to get back to our core morals and ethics. What I really think we've lost in this country is a sense of personal accountability, personal responsibility, and hard work. And I see that a lot in the younger generation, when some of my kids include it. And that's a dangerous trend that I don't like when I see it, because that has some pretty potential negative implications that we're already seeing. But the agency today is a shadow of what it used to be. And I hope it gets back on the right track. And I hope it gets back to the core mission of recruiting human sources and producing quality intelligence that will inform our policymakers on key issues. Stop right there. That's what we need to do. And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job.
I think as I'm talking to so many people, not only in the States, but out around the world, everyone was shocked at this attack by Hamas. But I think we as Americans have gotten pretty complacent, and we've always been free. We've got 247 years now. We've been successful, and we've got the Constitution. We have our freedoms of speech and religion and our guns and all. And, it's just going to always be there. And it's forgetting that our generation, if we don't fight to keep those rights and freedoms, we will lose them. It's not what our ancestors did or those gone before us that have done, but we on our watch, and we've been asleep, a lot of the public, of not taking the time. We're busy. We got 2 jobs, the family, all the stuff that's going on in life. And now people are saying, what happened? Why is this going on? As you know, I started out in Israel and Lebanon, and in those early days, and I've seen the Israelis do amazing things. I had them up on a pedestal. I mean, they were invincible. They would never get surprised. And then when this thing happened, how could this be? Friends on the ground there told me that there was warnings going to the intelligence about something's up. This is not a drill. This has been going on for months. They're planning something. We're picking up stuff. For some reason, whatever the intelligence did, they didn't pass that along to the political, or even some of it to the military. And they got surprised because they were complacent, thinking, well, it's going to be safer now. We got the Abraham Accord. And then one friend there told me this candidly. He said, Phil, there's some woke people in our intelligence. I mean, this whole thing is taken over here. And I said, what? In Israel? How could that happen? So we're seeing this spread worldwide. And I guess I'm looking at what's the solution. When I was speaking on terrorism back in the early 80s, started there before the Olympics in LA, had hundreds of meetings. And my whole goal was, I was talking about violence, I was talking about bad things, but I wanted to leave the people at the end with something positive, something they could take and do and take action, not just think about, violence is coming, I can't do anything about it. But from your position on strategy and your veteran of the CIA, what emerging innovations and technologies do you view as a top priority for our nation's defense? And possibly then these things could also be in the private sector.
First, I agree with everything you said. And I would add on the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. I think it's a combination of everything you said, Phil, and you and I know this. One is, and we do it all the time, and we have done it. The Israelis have done it. Lots of countries have done it. We come to rely on technology and our superior know-how, and that gives us a sense of arrogance and hubris that we're not going to be surprised. Look at Pearl Harbor. Look at 9/11. Look at the Maginot Line in World War II. All the Israelis had built this billion-dollar electronic wall. Nobody's going to get through it. We don't necessarily have to do what you and I are used to doing, which is the lost art of human intelligence. We don't have to go and talk to people anymore. We got that covered. And so I think there was part of that. There was a de-emphasis on human intelligence, which you and I have seen many, many cycles around in history. There was an over-reliance on our technology or technological superiority. And then there was this infighting or an internal conflict within the Israeli establishment between people who wanted to see the world as they would like it to be rather than how it is. And if you look at any history of Hamas, you understand that, first of all, they took power by force, right? There's been no elections in Gaza since 2007. This is a violent, militant group. They have never changed. They never will change, probably in the foreseeable future. For us to ascribe anything else other than that is just ignorance. Look, a perfect case was Afghanistan after we withdrew ignominiously, right? And the Taliban came in, and a lot of these people were saying, oh, they're going to respect women's rights now. They're going to do this. Guess what? They went back to being the same repressive, nasty Taliban that they were before. They didn't change. And so we need, in terms of traits, and I'll get to the technologies here in a second, we need critical thinking skills. We need those combined with in-depth experience in the field, on the ground, like you and I have done our whole careers. There is no substitute for that. Brian Michael Jenkins, who's probably one of the smartest guys on counterterrorism, and I know you know him from RAND Corporation, former U.S. Army paratrooper. He's been in this business as long as you have, Phil. He writes, and it's funny, he says, he wrote a brilliant article, said, what makes a great counterterrorism practitioner? And he had all the things, the critical thinking skills, the street smarts, but he said, nothing takes the place of practical experience. And so you can't get that anywhere but other than doing the job. And I think we lack a lot of those type of people in our important institutions. Now, in terms of technologies, I'm happy to comment on that. We are on the artificial intelligence, the AI bandwagon. We got to stay on that. That's going to have a fundamental impact on a lot of different innovations. The drone technology, both maritime, land, and air, as you know, all three of those types of drones are being used in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, to great effect. That's going to be a wave of the future, not only drone technology, but counter drone technology. Remote sensing at long distances. In other words, very exquisite sensing systems that can remotely at long distances gather information for you. And then, of course, I think anything space-based is kind of going to be the wave of the future in terms of dominating telecommunications, dominating imagery and surveillance. These are the things that we're going to have to really keep our ear to the ground in terms of a country, and hopefully innovate and do research and development and come out on top in a lot of these so that we can maintain our advantage over our adversaries in the world.
Do you see or have any concerns about dangers from AI and it getting let go and going someplace that nobody imagined? What's your thoughts on that?
You and I remember when Terminator movies came out and it was so science fiction at the time. Hey, we're living in the Terminator days now. Skynet is not an impossibility anymore. And I think there was four, and I've done a lot of research on the subject. There were four main men who kind of founded AI and drove it forward. They're called the four godfathers, right? Two of the four of them have expressed serious concerns about the future of AI. That should make all of us pause, okay? If these pioneers in the field are like, I don't know about this, we're going to have to control this. I think it's already being used by extremist individuals and extremist groups. It's going to be used to disseminate propaganda. It's going to be used to recruit new members. They're going to use AI in the metaverse to plan attacks. They're going to use AI to actually carry out attacks, maybe on a cyber system or infrastructure system. The Russians and Chinese are certainly using AI against us to try to interfere in our internal, not only political system, but within our economy as well. That's something maybe that your listeners and most Americans don't understand. The level of official Russian and official Chinese disruption and activities within our country, within our economy, within our infrastructure is massive compared to what it was just 2 years ago, much less 5 years ago. And that is a serious, serious obstacle. That is a serious threat to the future of our country. And we're being overwhelmed by it, quite frankly. I think FBI Director Wray talked about that as well. The overwhelming theft of our intellectual property by the Chinese. We are, in reality, losing our economic edge because the Chinese are simply stealing it from us, and we're allowing that to happen. So there's a lot of not so great trends that I see out there that we're going to have to figure out a way to overcome a lot of these challenges. And if you ask me the solution is strong, focused leadership that also understands, has a substantive expertise in all these areas, whether it's counterintelligence and going after Chinese IP theft, whether it's cybersecurity and strengthening our system, whether it's mitigating Russian efforts to interfere in our election process, whether it's making sure we have a set of regulations and worldwide governance of use of AI. All this is going to take very strong leadership, very focused leadership that has a vision for the future, but also has a basis and substantive expertise in all the issues that they're talking about.
As we look at America and focus on our country, I've been saying over the years that I'm concerned about what's going on. Now I would have to say I'm alarmed at where we're at, what has happened. Everybody knows I make it very clear that I operate from a biblical worldview. We're not talking about religions or anything like that, but I believe that the Bible has a good set of principles, and 10 Commandments are something that we can learn something through and follow. And I believe also in a creator God that his word is true. And when this nation has been so blessed, our country is like no other. And when you think about the history, I'm trying to think, I just lost the Walls Without Borders. I lost him right now, but he is an expert. He's researched our founding history. And they've got, I think, 100,000 original documents in some form. But as you listen to how our country was formed and all of the deception that goes on about what's in the Constitution, like the separation of church and state. Well, it's not like what they say. Or in a faith group can't talk about political things. And it's all propaganda, but we've fallen into that and we believe it. You mentioned that we've seen these cycles and we've come out of them. This time, something's different. We've gone further this time. There's stuff going on, not only here and in the world, that we have so focusedly taken God out of everything. We want it wiped out, his name wiped out of our history with teaching falsehoods about our history. I'm concerned that unless a large majority of we Americans rise up. Now, we saw a little taste of that. Steve Garvey got with a runoff at least, but we Americans are going to have to rise up and stand for freedom and do whatever it takes to take our country back. And unless enough of us do that, I am very alarmed at what our future is going to be.
I agree with you. I'm as alarmed as I've ever been in my lifetime. And I try to really inject some common sense and critical thinking into it and think back, what were the generations right before the Civil War saying? It was equally dark times in our country that actually led us to the most horrible time in our country when we were killing each other, right? That must have been horribly dark, and it didn't look like there was any path at the end of the tunnel. So we've been in the birth of our country through a revolution, which we almost lost. There was a lot of ways that could have gone the other way. So I think we've faced serious times before, but this is probably one of the most serious. And again, I think it's a crisis of the personal accountability, personal code of ethics, faith on all of us, including our leaders. But as you say, it comes down to the individual American. Again, we go back to Reagan. I think the further away we get from him, and look, he had his faults like everyone, okay? The further away we get from his presidency, I think the greater we realize that he was. And I know you know his quote on freedom is only a generation away from being lost. And you alluded to that at the beginning of the broadcast here. I totally agree with that. And it's up for individual Americans right now to stand up and voice your concerns about what you see is going on around you, whether that's at your kid's PTA meeting, whether that's at your local school board, whether that's at your city council or board of supervisor, whether that's writing letters to your state government or federal government or getting on the phone. And then every day in your actions, not standing for what you see is wrong around you. And if all of us do that, enough of us do that, this wrong will quickly be turned to a right. I noticed with trepidation that there's a movie coming out in April called Civil War, and it's about a modern day civil war in the US. That was unthinkable even a couple years ago. But now even smart guys like you and I have a little fear in the back of our mind, however small, like, is this even a possibility or something like that? The level of divisiveness and partisanship. So I'm not optimistic, like you say, about November coming up here. I think it's going to actually be a horrible shit show around our elections. And it won't matter what side wins. It won't matter who runs. It won't matter what side wins for president. The other side will claim that it was stolen from them. And I think we're for a period of unrest and chaos and violence, and foreign countries like Russia and China are now going to be poised to take advantage of that at an even greater rate. So what we can do right now is your call. It's a call to action, right? It's a call to faith.
Right.
It's a call to your principles. You got to stand up in your everyday lives, both your personal and professional lives, for what you believe in, because we may get to a point where it's almost too late to change things back and to make things right.
And I think we're approaching that cliff. And I have people tell me, oh, well, it's always been mentioned some of the things. We've always had bad things and they've come and gone and all that. But go back a little further. Go back to Rome. Go back to some of these cultures before us. This time, we didn't have it in the Civil War. We didn't have it in our founding fight to found the country. This time, our youth, our destruction of unborn, our disavowing the parents' rights to teach and train their children, this whole thing with gender. We have stuff going on now that you have to go back a long way to find it. They were doing it then too. And those nations all fell. Not one of them survived. And we could also talk about our internal things with our open border, our invitation to come in. No country can survive with open borders. What's your take on the border situation and what's going on?
Bill, I cannot, and you and I mean, you live close to there. You've been back and forth on either side, as have I. We understand it, I think, as well as anybody. I cannot figure out why action is not being taken. It just boggles our mind. And look, there used to be the old philosophy that the Republican Party wants illegal immigrants because it's cheap labor for their businesses, and the Democrats want illegal immigrants because it's the next generation of voters. It's destroying our country. And look, we're all immigrants here. We're not talking about stealing the borders. We're talking about an orderly flow of people who want to come to this country that are vetted and validated and enter this country like all our forefathers did, or most of them did. And to have the numbers, the sheer numbers that are coming over every day, every week, you cannot sustain that as a society. It's not like it's a couple thousand. We're talking tens of thousands every day, every week. You cannot sustain that as a society, like you said, without significant impacts. And the impacts are not going to be positive. They're going to be negative. And it's no fault of the people coming over. They're looking for a better life. It's not their fault. It's the fault of our system that allows this to happen. And I can't understand why more firm action isn't being taken. I think this issue and this issue alone is going to be a huge one coming up in the elections this summer. And people are being quiet about it because they don't trust the polls and they don't want to get shouted down and censored out. But I think it's going to be an equally important issue as with of any other issue, because I think Americans are finally saying, this is crazy. We can't do this. And we make the point, you talked about gender and all this. Let me give your viewers and your listeners my kind of philosophy on this. Guys like Phil and I, we absolutely believe in our hearts and have always believed in our hearts. What you want to do in your privacy of your own home is your business. It really is. As long as you're not hurting someone or breaking the laws, that's your business. You want to believe in a God, don't believe in a God. You want to say you're male, female, trans, that's your business. You want to dress a certain way, absolutely your business. And we will stand and fight and die for you to have that right, the right of freedom in this great country of ours. Where we object is when you try to foist that belief onto me. Not only foist it onto me and say, you should believe this way, but say, Bob, if you don't believe this way, there's something wrong with you. Because at that point,
Right.
you are not then respecting my set of beliefs and my right to have freedom. I'm perfectly willing to accept yours. All I ask in return is you accept mine. And that is not what's happening, Phil. And that's where I have a big problem with what's going on with people in this country today.
What is shocking to me, and I didn't think I'd be shocked about too many things in the world, but as I keep learning about this invasion thing, is the side effects. As you mentioned, there are people who are looking for a better life. But as you look into this and dig into it, you find that there was a system set up for a purpose to get as many people in as fast as they can. And not only did they set up the logistics, they set up the transportation. I did this look at the Darien Gap down in Panama, and the camps that are set up there, they're manned by NGOs funded by the U.S. government. There are people coming in there in droves every day. And then that 60-mile walk across there is the most evil, destructive thing that could happen. But what was interesting was, outside of those camps, you see a lot of children, families, you see a lot of all types of people, and they're open. In fact, you can talk to them. They will tell you about their life and what's going on. A few miles away, there is a camp that's total Chinese. And within that camp, there are mostly young men. There are not hardly any children or women. And they're coming with suitcases. They're dressed well. And they don't walk through the jungle. They take transportation around. But they're getting briefed. They're getting set up. But they're using this cartel approach. I remember, Fritz, back in the 80s, we were talking, and he coined this narco terrorism. And we were briefing down in Mexico and talking about, and we were looking at Hezbollah and was active in Baja, and then Hamas is there now. And why then are all these Chinese, instead of flying into the U.S. and trying to get in, they're going, thousands of them, and then they're coming up via the cartels across into the U.S. There's stuff going on. And then the sexual violence and that is happening. It's hard to imagine that any politician, I don't care what side you're on, that would look at this and would not have some conscience about, I could stop this. I'd better do it. I
agree. It baffles my mind why we are not taking action. And even the conservatives and the Republicans seem stuck on this. And I know they're banging the drum now, but my God, this is our border. You got the power of the federal government. We've got some really smart people. This can be solved and sorted out very quickly. And I don't understand why there's not the will all the way around to do this when it's obviously such a harm to our society. I think one of the most ironic things and one of the kind of funniest to me tactics with some of these southern governors like Abbott in Texas shipping these illegals to Democratic and northern states, which don't experience that problem, quite frankly, let's be honest, that much. And all of a sudden, very quickly, These cities like New York City and Chicago are getting overwhelmed, and their own residents are saying, hey, what's going on? And so a lot of the problem at the border, Phil, I think can be explained by that phenomenon, that the vast part of America never experiences the problems associated with this mass influx of illegal immigration until now. And now they're starting to feel it, even in places like Colorado. And what happens? Instantly, people of all stripes say, hey, wait a second, we got to control this. This is bad. So I think that as much as those governors can keep shipping people to other parts of the country and showing them, unfortunately, what this negative impact has, which is not against the illegals, but we know extremist groups, we know countries that are adversaries of us, we know criminal groups are using these streams to get people into the U.S. to do things in this country that are going to hurt our country. We want an ordered immigration system that allows real people a chance to come here and bring a skill set and start a new life. That's what we want. It's easily doable. We can easily do it. And I just don't understand, like you, why it's not being done.
We could talk all day, Bob, about it. Then we could also weave in a few war stories along the way.
Yes, we could.
But the other thing that we're faced with, and it couples with also the same reason I think that immigration has not been fixed, is our debt. Most Americans don't get what $34 trillion are growing. I think it grows $1 trillion about every 100 days. We can't sustain that. But the problem is, on both sides, if we're going to fix some of these problems, we're going to have some belt tightening. It's going to take some short-term pain, and neither side is willing, and it'd take both sides to agree to do it, to go to the American people and lay it out and say, here's what we got to do. It's kind of like that leader. I've watched a couple of things on him from El Salvador. And you look at some of his things, but man, he turned it around, right? But it took some pain. And I'm not sure that it's going to happen with our politicians. What do we want to, we've talked about people getting involved. We've talked about individuals standing up and letting their voice be heard. And I can tell you again, folks, as we found in the early 80s there in Los Angeles, when there was the attack on taking away police intelligence in Los Angeles prior to the Olympics, and some of us got involved. The ACLU and their supporters were all going to the city council and say they didn't need it. They were ready to disband it. And then a few of us got involved, and we formed the Citizens Committee. And then there were thousands of us. Well, we stopped that from being disbanded prior to the Olympics. We're going to have something like that again. But one can make a difference.
Yeah.
And if the ones come together. So what kind of a positive note, Bob, could we leave people on today after we've talked about all the issues of the...
I remain cautiously optimistic as you are. I think the spirit of the American people will ultimately come through. I think this is our most challenging time that I've ever seen in my lifetime, but I think it will come through. We survived the Civil War. We survived World War II. But as you say, we cannot take it for granted anymore. We cannot leave it to the military or the police. Every one of us has to be involved at every level. And when you do that little action on your own, again, voicing your concerns at a PTA meeting about what's being taught, going to the school board and challenging them on some of their ridiculous, absurd policies, getting involved in your local city council meetings or running for office yourself. When you do that, that sends a little ripple of a wave out. And if enough people do that, those little ripples build into a wave that sweeps across the country. And I think I've seen little faint glimmers of that so far, but we're up against a very determined set of obstacles and adversaries. And I cannot underestimate the disruptive impact of Russia and China and how they're stoking a lot of this and how big money is flowing to people that don't want to see this country do well, including Americans. And by the way, I'll shout out to the private sector too. Stop cozying up to the Chinese. Stop, if you can, being such good business partners. They are not our friends. And we have sold out so much of our technology, Phil. We have sold out so much of our actual real estate. We have sold out so much of our manufacturing capability, all for the almighty dollar, when we know it's not going to serve our country's interests. And so that's the individual responsibility I'm talking about. Don't have it always be about the bottom line. You got to stand for something more than the bottom line. And that's where your faith can come in and help you as well, right? Because it isn't just all about the dollar. It's about preserving what we have in this country. Because if you don't preserve it, if that American dream is not alive, then what are we all doing here? Then it all falls apart and we have nothing. We really do. And that exceptionalism, and I still believe in American exceptionalism, that exceptionalism will die if each one of us just goes about our way and does nothing. We're not talking about violence here. We're talking about being involved and standing up for what you believe is right and voicing that. And that also educates those around you. Talk to people around you. Get into discussions. Ask them why they feel the way they do. Most of them don't have good answers. They're just feeding the propaganda. They're just consuming the propaganda that a lot of our biased news organizations put out, unfortunately. So I find when you start talking to people and you really ask them, well, why do you feel this way or that way? They don't really have a great answer. So that's another positive way that you can influence people and educate them, much like you're doing with this show, Phil, is presenting some facts or some opinions and perspectives from some pretty learned people, hopefully, and then letting your audience decide based on both sides of the story.
And one thing I was going to bring up, and it was faith-based issues, and particularly after the shooting in Lakewood in Houston a few weeks ago. And as I mentioned to you, I watched the film of that being all the different film they brought together. And it was evidence of a lack of training. I know you're doing some of that. What's your opinion on the churches and faith-based groups and others should be doing today with this threat that we're faced with?
Unfortunately, I just did some with a Christ-based church, Calvary Chapel down here in Irvine, California. I've done a lot of work with the Jewish community, as you mentioned at the beginning. The rise and the nakedness of the anti-Semitism that you and I have seen in this country and worldwide, quite frankly, shocked you and I, even though we're used to it. And so I was really, wow, that was just stunning to me. So I think all faith-based communities, and of course, there's been some hate crimes against the Islamic community and Hindus and Sikhs. All communities now need to take, and I know there's several Bible passages that talk about, the four-armed man or the forewarned man is the righteous man, right? There's nothing wrong with being attuned to your situational awareness, having a good security plan in place, having good common sense, practicing some drills in case you need them, whether it's for a natural disaster or a fire or earthquake, or in this case, an active shooter. Every house of worship should be doing those things. And obviously people like you and me, Phil, we offer that type of specialized training. And what's neat about that, and I'm sure you feel the same way as I do, is it's such a great feeling to be able to give back to a faith-based community that we're a part of. And that kind of feels like we're really achieving the mission there, one of our missions, one of our core missions in life, so to speak.
Well, I think the thing that after watching the Lakewood, so many churches will hire some off-duty people. Now, these people that were in uniform were off-duty, but they had no training in this type of active shooter. It was obvious. So you don't need to, a church shouldn't be just hiring some off-duty guys to come in and stand around and look at their phones and kind of mingle in. They need training on being active. So that's an important thing. Now, Bob, how can people reach you if they want to reach you on some of these areas? You're a consultant and you do all kinds of work in these areas. How could people reach you?
Yeah, my company is, thanks, Phil, Tartarus Intel. I'm at www.tartarusintel.com. You can get me at robert@tartarusintel.com. I'm also on LinkedIn under Bob Doughtery. So anybody that I can assist informally or formally, please reach out. I'll be happy to help out. This is, again, part of our mission too, right? Phil and I are in this to try to make our country better. So it's about business when we can do business, but it's also about all of us strengthening each other and helping each other. It's the only way we're going to turn this tide that both Phil and I think is already here and is kind of creeping up and overwhelming us to some aspect, that we all got to work together to right this wrong.
Yes, and I will put Bob's information on the screen later, as well as in the comments. As you can see, what I said up front, he just proved what I said. He's very good at all these areas. And thank you for all the comments and emails that I get. Keep that up. Keep them coming. Give us your thoughts, your questions, your ideas, or things you would like to hear about. And you can do that on any of the platforms by the comments, or you can contact me directly at pi777 Now, until next time, be safe. May God bless you. May God bless your family. May God bless America. And thank you, Bob, for being with us today.
Amen.